What if I told you that one of the most powerful men on Earth officially looks, on paper, almost modest, while years of investigations describe a completely different world, a world of loyalists, offshore structures, state-linked money, and financial shadows? That contrast is what makes Vladimir Putin's money story so fascinating. This is not the clean, easy-to-follow wealth story of a public entrepreneur. There is no neat shareholder letter, no transparent portfolio, no simple breakdown you can verify line by line. Instead, there are two versions of the same man: the official version and the version suggested by investigators, prosecutors, and sanctions authorities. And in between those two versions is where the real personal finance lesson begins. Officially, Putin's public disclosures are strikingly plain. In the most recently published Kremlin-era declaration for 2021, he reported about 10.2 million rubles in income and listed a 77-square-meter apartment, an 18-square-meter garage, two vintage Gaz M21 cars, a Niva SUV, and a skiff trailer. In his 2024 election filing, Russian election records showed roughly 67.6 million rubles earned over the previous 6 years, from sources that included his presidential salary, bank deposits, securities, pensions, and property sales. In other words, the official story says his money comes from the same basic buckets ordinary people understand: salary, investments, savings income, and asset sales. To understand how Putin built influence around money, you have to go back before the Kremlin, before the war headlines, before the cult of power. Britannica notes that he studied law, served for 15 years in the KGB, then returned to St. Petersburg, where he worked under Mayor Anatoly Sobchak and rose to become first deputy mayor. That part matters because his path was never the classic path of a founder building a business from customers upward. His real asset was access. His edge was proximity to institutions, proximity to decisions, proximity to the people who controlled permits, contracts, property, and power. And that is the first big insight. Putin did not become financially significant through a public portfolio the way Warren Buffett did, or through a product empire the way tech founders do. The model around him, at least according to the public record and major investigations, is a system where political power and economic opportunity move together. When you control the gate, you often do not need to publicly own the building. When you influence the flow, you do not always need your name on the asset. For personal finance viewers, that sounds extreme, but the principle in legal everyday life is simple. The biggest leap in wealth usually comes not from hourly effort alone, but from controlling valuable decisions, distribution, and relationships. Under Putin, Russia moved towards a far more centralized economic model. Britannica says he renationalized key industries, and that, by some estimates, the state came to control as much as 70% of the Russian economy. It also notes that oligarchs were allowed to keep their positions only so long as they stayed loyal and out of politics. A Peterson Institute policy brief described how key sectors such as finance, energy, and media reverted towards state ownership, while other industries fell into the hands of business people close to the president. That is not a normal investing playbook. It's a power playbook. It suggests that the engine of wealth in Putin's orbit was not just owning stocks, but controlling who got access to strategic assets in the first place. That same pattern shows up in how authorities outside Russia have described his financial circle. In 2014, the Treasury called Bank Rossiya the personal bank for senior Russian officials and said Yuri Kovalchuk was a close advisor and the personal banker for senior officials, including Putin. Treasury also tied Bank Rossiya to members of Putin's inner circle connected to the Ozero Dacha Cooperative, an old network of associates that has appeared repeatedly in reporting on the consolidation of elite wealth around him. Again, notice the pattern. Money here is not just about return on investment. It's about trust, loyalty, and insider access. Then came one of the biggest revelations tied to Putin's circle, the Panama Papers. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists reported that Sergei Roldugin, a close friend of Putin, was part of a clandestine network operated by Putin associates that shuffled at least $2 billion through banks and offshore companies. The documents did not put Putin's own name directly on those offshore companies, and that distinction is important, but the reporting suggested a model that anyone studying elite wealth should understand. Assets can sit with proxies, influence can sit with allies, and beneficial control can be harder to prove than legal ownership. Putin rejected links to offshore dealings, and the Kremlin said the claims were politically motivated. The story did not end there. Associated Press reported on Swiss proceedings involving bankers tied to accounts linked to Roldugin, and noted that the U.S. Treasury has described Roldugin as part of a system that manages Putin's offshore wealth. Reuters later reported that bankers who helped move millions through Swiss accounts linked to Roldugin lost an appeal after earlier convictions for failing to perform due diligence. None of that is the same thing as a public balance sheet with Putin's signature on it, and that's exactly the point. The Putin wealth story is powerful because it is so hard to reduce to a neat spreadsheet. Since 2023, Russia has also stopped making officials' declarations public during what the Kremlin calls the special military operation, which makes outside verification even harder. So what are the money lessons for ordinary people? First, diversify your income sources. Even Putin's official disclosures, the modest version, do not rely on one stream alone. They mention salary, bank deposits, securities, pensions, and property sales. Most people will never have political power, nor should they want wealth built on secrecy and fear, but they can still copy one healthy principle. Never depend on a single paycheck if you can help it. Build layered income. A salary pays the bills, yes, but savings interest, broad market investments, retirement accounts, rental income, and occasionally smart asset sales are what make finances resilient. Second, understand the power of positioning. Putin's life shows, in the most dramatic way possible, that proximity to important decisions can be more valuable than visible income. In normal life, that does not mean chasing corruption. It means putting yourself where value is created. Work in growing industries. Learn skills tied to capital allocation, sales, operations, technology, or distribution. Build a reputation for solving expensive problems. The market pays far more for access, trust, and decision-making than it pays for raw effort alone. If you want to increase your income, do not just work harder, move closer to where money moves. Third, relationships are a financial asset, but only when they are built ethically. Putin's financial mythology, both official and unofficial, revolves around circles of loyalty. For ordinary people, the clean version of that lesson is powerful. Your network matters. The people who recommend you, partner with you, invest with you, or open doors for you can change your financial future faster than any budgeting hack. But here's the warning attached to that lesson. Relationships that depend on fear, secrecy, or political protection are fragile. Relationships built on competence and trust are durable. One compounds risk, the other compounds opportunity. Fourth, visible lifestyle can be misleading. On paper, Putin's official asset list looks almost absurdly ordinary for a man who has dominated Russian politics for decades. Whether you see that as proof of modesty or proof of opacity, the personal finance takeaway is the same. Appearances are a terrible way to measure wealth. Some broke people look rich. Some rich people look ordinary. Real financial strength is not the car, the watch, or the flex. It is optionality. It is the ability to absorb shocks, to say no, to move capital, to survive crises, and to stay in control when the world gets unstable. Fifth, transparency matters more than people think. The deepest lesson in Putin's finances is not that secrecy is clever. It is that secrecy creates a permanent fog, and fog destroys trust. Investors demand a discount when they cannot verify facts. Citizens lose faith when public power and private wealth blur together. Families make worse decisions when money is hidden. So for your own life, do the opposite. Keep clear records, Know what you own. Know what you owe. Automate savings. Use boring, regulated investment vehicles. Pay taxes cleanly. Build wealth you can explain on one sheet of paper. That kind of simplicity is not weakness, it is freedom. And maybe that's the most emotional lesson in this whole story. Putin's money image, whether you focus on the official filings or the darker allegations around his circle, is ultimately a story about control. Control of information, control of institutions, control of access. But ordinary people do not need that kind of control to win financially. They need something quieter and better: self-control. The discipline to save when nobody is clapping. The patience to invest when nothing feels exciting. The maturity to ignore status games. The courage to build slowly, legally, visibly, and well. So if you take one lesson from Vladimir Putin's personal finance story, let it be this: wealth is rarely just about income. It is about systems. It is about who controls assets, who controls access, who controls information, and who controls the flow of money. In Putin's case, the public evidence suggests that official salary tells only a small part of the story, while investigations and sanctions reporting point to a much larger architecture built around allies, strategic sectors, and hidden channels. But for the rest of us, the best version of that lesson is not secrecy, it is structure. Build a system around your own life. Multiple income streams, long-term investing, strong relationships, clean records, low ego, high patience. Because real financial power is not looking rich, it is being secure, steady, and hard to shake.